It calls for the election of representatives of all members of society to work for the good of all. Its success depends entirely on the quality and integrity of the people who try to put it into action. It's not surprising to find that in ancient Greece things went wrong, and it lasted barely 100 years. It's not surprising to find that in our own day, establishing democracy is a trying affair. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. But what is quite clear is that under some kind of democracy, where individual liberty, freedom of thought, and following the rule of law are the norm, human beings flourish as under no other system. So it's definitely worth struggling for.
Also voted Wednesday to support a resolution doing so. The city mayor accused Israel of carrying out what he called a campaign of apartheid and collective punishment. The resolution calls Israel's actions a war crime. Council members argue that Israel is breaking international law by shutting off access to electricity, drinking water, food, and aid. While a local official criticized the resolution for failing to condemn the Hamas terrorist attacks. Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th, killing an estimated 1,400 people and injuring about 5,000, mostly civilians. The group also took some 220 hostages. The most sophisticated money laundering probe in Australian history. After a 14-month investigation, authorities charged 7 people with helping a Chinese crime group launder over $140 million in dirty money. Let's zoom in. Captagon. It's been called a jihadist drug and has also been used by ISIS terrorists. NTD's Faye Quarter has more.
Captagon, a powerful stimulant, was reportedly found in the pockets of dead or captured Hamas terrorists who attacked Israel on October 7th. Captagon is an amphetamine, originally created in the 1960s in Germany to combat ADHD and narcolepsy, while stimulating the central nervous system. Most countries stopped using Captagon in 1986 because of its addictive properties and adverse effects. But its popularity remains strong in the Middle East, despite being banned by Middle Eastern governments.
It became very popular for terrorist leaders in various groups to give to individuals first in the process of breaking them down mentally and indoctrinating them, and also in particular before operations, because it made them more hyperactive, more ruthless.
Geopolitical analyst Irina Zuckerman says the terror groups use the drug to control the fighters. They become more compliant, more open to suggestion, and more addicted.
Its primary function is to increase this combat readiness, and you can even see from watching some of these terrorists from their own videos that they filmed with body cameras that they looked significantly more alert, significantly more hyperactive.
Although it's banned in the Middle East, terror groups like Hezbollah produce it cheaply and easily. They also smuggle it through various ports. Experts believe most production takes place in Syria, where an estimated $3.5 billion worth of Captagon was exported in 2020. Faye Quarter, NTD News.
Palestine, the Gaza Strip, I should say. It's the ruling government. And in that scenario, it seems to be impossible to work out a long-term working relationship. So that's why there's argument saying Israel needs to take out Hamas. Not all of Palestinians, but get rid of the controlling leadership. Would be nice if that could be done peacefully, but that's not the way it's heading, it looks like.
And when it comes to this Israel-Hamas war, there is, of course, the kinetic element, but there's also the information war that seems to be happening. You have a book on disinformation. How do we navigate this, whether it's what we see on social media, the rise in AI?
Yeah, it's huge, and that really has been a tactic that Hamas, Hezbollah, other groups in the Middle East have really deployed, where we hear about bombing of the hospital, and that there's horrible stuff going on. Then it turns out it probably wasn't Israel who bombed the hospital. It was probably a misfired rocket, in fact, from Hamas. That's an old technique that's been in play in the Middle East for my life, anyway. And what we have to do, soldiers and generals make decisions in a matter of minutes, if not seconds. Those of us at home who have a little more time to digest need to take that time to digest before we make rash decisions. We need to look and question information that comes, particularly when it comes from a partisan source. And that was true during World War II, certainly true during Vietnam, and it's true today. There will be depictions designed strictly to influence the populace to say that they're the bad guys, not us. And you've got to double check those matters and probably give it a little time to percolate too, because a lot of times what seems to be the story one day has changed dramatically a week later.
We did see that in terms of this hospital blast reporting. Well, Ron Rychlak, thank you so much for your time.
In response, the U.S. Pacific Fleet issued a statement describing those claims as inaccurate, adding that the video clips China released were just segments from a 90-minute interaction. Back to the mid-air incident, last week the Pentagon released footage of over 180 such interactions with Chinese fighter jets, all coming dangerously close to American aircraft in international airspace.
The PRC can and must end this behavior. Full stop.
PRC stands for China's official name, the People's Republic of China. Another clip shows a Chinese jet flying 10 feet below a U.S. plane. In yet another close encounter, a Chinese jet again just 20 feet from an American jet.
A powerful message from Florida Governor and presidential candidate Ron DeSantis. The Israel-Hamas war benefits China. That's amid concerns that U.S. military funding and resources are being increasingly tied up in both Ukraine and the Middle East. Watch.
So yes, China, I think they like the Hamas-Israel conflict. And I'm not saying, Israel needs to defend itself, and they're a great ally of ours, and we'll support them of that. But these things, clearly, the way the world has gone the last 2 years benefits China. There's no question.
That's Florida Governor and presidential candidate Ron DeSantis on Friday, speaking to American Thought Leaders host Yanya Kellick and Heritage Society president Kevin Roberts. He describes how China is the key player behind both the Ukraine and Middle East wars.
The CCP is keeping both Iran and Russia afloat financially. China's purchasing massive amounts of Iranian oil on the black market, thereby enriching the mullahs. And Russia is selling China gas and much, much more, and that is bolstering Russia's war machine.
And he says that poses an even greater concern for the United States.
Now, lengthy conflicts, particularly between Russia and Ukraine, will ultimately benefit China because it will distract America and it will deplete our already dwindling Western weapons and ammunition stockpiles.
As for how severe that threat is,
the threat posed by the CCP requires our primary focus and attention right now. Our goal from a national security perspective vis-a-vis the CCP is very simple. We win and they lose.
To address that threat, DeSantis proposes an expansion of the U.S. Navy fleet with the additional pathway for 600 warships in the next 2 decades. He also said that if elected, he'll make it easier for Taiwan to purchase advanced weapons.
We cannot raise the white flag of surrender. We have time to get this right, but time is running out.
As the West looks to counter China's growing global influence, DeSantis said a strong West will require more American leadership.
More news from California. Governor Gavin Newsom visited the Great Wall of China on Thursday. This after talks with Chinese climate officials. Newsom is on a week-long tour of China where he's pushing for climate cooperation.
It's not lost on me that we're in the Great Wall of China, talking about how we can tear down the walls of division between our countries. We're here in the spirit of partnership, in the spirit of the Commonwealth.
California and China issued a declaration on Wednesday pledging to work together. California has an economy larger than most countries. Governors of the state have a long history of partnering with China. Zooming in on California, in the U.S. especially, what's the similarities here? Is this a wake-up call for the U.S.?
Well, it should be, and I've talked about Santa Muerte. I've also talked about Santa Maria and some of the others, but what you need to know is that Santa Muerte is one of the fastest growing cults in the world. And there's over 10 million followers now. You know, in the southern border region, those who have worked it know Santa Muerte very well because we've been dealing with smugglers and cartel members in the Halcon network who leverage Santa Muerte. You'll see the shrines and stash houses. You'll see the stickers that have Santa Muerte. And if you go back 2-3 decades, you know, we've been seeing this along the border region for many, many years. I used to actually, in 2004, as an undercover narcotics agent in Brownsville, Texas, I had a witch that worked for me. And she would literally go out back. She would cut a chicken's head off. She would pray around a fire. And then she would walk out to a vehicle that had just pulled up as we were watching the house because she worked for us. And she would bless the load before it moved on. And these smugglers would get out of the car and look at it and watch her and thank her for what she had done, prayed it, got back in. And they truly believed in this stuff. And then as they went up, you know, we'd have the Border Patrol checkpoint knock it down. They had no idea that DPS Narcotics was following them. And we did that countless times. But these witches are real, and they give offerings to the underworld. This is a very important point. They literally give offerings to the underworld to help them move drug loads into the country or for whatever else they're going to do. And you see that in Mexico in a lot of the propaganda that the cartels are involved with. You'll see them kill people and behead them in these horrible propaganda films. And you'll see Santa Muerte shrines there as they make offerings to the underworld. And it's a real thing. And unfortunately now, you know, I've traveled all over the country. Santa Muerte is seen throughout the United States now. It's not just a border region thing. So that icon, that praying to the underworld is a real thing, and it is occurring in Mexico. So there's a lot of similarities there. Now, does it drive violence in Mexico? Absolutely. Does it drive violence in the United States? I don't think so yet domestically. Now, I'm not saying it hasn't, because we see it, Santa Muerte shrines, all the time on the border region. But in Mexico, you can clearly see its driving and its involvement in hyper-violence in Mexico. And just so the viewers are aware, Mexican citizens have been hit the hardest in Mexico. They've lost over 341,000 Mexican citizens since 2007. That story's never told because journalists are executed down there. And we have to remember, Mexican citizens cannot be forgotten here. And I talk about this quite often because they have really been hit the hardest here. The problem is that story is not getting out. I'll just say one last thing here. When you think of what's taken place to these citizens, and I give you a number like 341,000 dead, that's just the ones we know about. And the way the collection of people killed in Mexico has taken place, it's terrible. So anyone that gives you numbers, I can tell you they are a lot higher in the number of deaths that occurred to citizens in that country.
And to your point, it seems, you know, Reporters Without Borders is saying Mexico is now one of the most dangerous places for journalists. In terms of getting this information to paint a better picture, what can be done?
Well, there's a lot that can be done. First, illuminate it. And that's exactly why the three men here, you know, and I'm honored to be on this panel with them, we're all trying to do that because I'm a firm believer that I don't have to sell the border crisis. I don't have to sell what's happening in Mexico against Mexican citizens and our own. I just have to show it. The problem is getting it to the American people, unfortunately, today, because so many in the media will not talk about what's really taking place here. I think because they look at it through an immigration issue. Don't get me wrong, immigration's a big deal. But when you start breaking down the layers like the other guys here on the panel have talked about, and you really look at the impacts to people in Mexico, our own country, and around the world, you see where the real threats are and why we've got to illuminate. Because I will say this to you, and I mean this to the very core of who I am. I don't care if you're left, right, up, or down. No one is okay with what is happening to people if we can just get what's really been taking place to them.
Iran and Russia afloat financially. China's purchasing massive amounts of Iranian oil on the black market, thereby enriching the mullahs. And Russia is selling China gas and much, much more, and that is bolstering Russia's war machine.
And he says that poses an even greater concern for the United States.
Now, lengthy conflicts, particularly between Russia and Ukraine, will ultimately benefit China because it will distract America and it will deplete our already dwindling Western weapons and ammunition stockpiles.
As for how severe that threat is,
the threat posed by the CCP requires our primary focus and attention right now. Our goal from a national security perspective vis-a-vis the CCP is very simple. We win and they lose.
To address that threat, DeSantis proposes an expansion of the U.S. Navy fleet with the additional pathway for 600 warships in the next 2 decades. He also said that if elected, he'll make it easier for Taiwan to purchase advanced weapons.
We cannot raise the white flag of surrender. We have time to get this right, but time is running out.
As the West looks to counter China's growing global influence, DeSantis said a strong West will require more American leadership.
More news from California. Governor Gavin Newsom visited the Great Wall of China on Thursday. This after talks with Chinese.
شعبنا الفلسطيني المسلم لا يرضى أن يكون لوطي واحد يجاهر بفاحشته. هل ترضون أن يكون على أرض القدس وفلسطين لوطيا واحد؟ هل ترضون؟ ولا يرضى شعبنا أن توجد مؤسسات للفاحشة ومقدماتها على أرض فلسطين المباركة الطاهرة، ولا يقبل أن تمس أحكام الشريعة بنقص أو تبديل، ولا يرضى بالمناهج المناهضة لأحكام الإسلام. فاقتدوا يا مسلمون برسولكم صلى الله عليه وسلم، وضعوا تحت أقدامكم كل منكر وكل حرام وكل ما يخالف دينكم الإسلام. ومن الفسوق الاختلاط في الجامعات، وقد رأيتم بعض نتائجه بقتل بعض الطالبات في بعض الجامعات العربية. ونؤكد رفضنا وبغضنا لكل مظاهر المثلية والشذوذ، والتي هي اللواط الذي أهلك الله مجرميه بالعذاب الشديد. ونؤكد رفضنا القاطع لوجود المؤسسات التي تدعو إلى الشذوذ والإباحية، ونطالب بإغلاقها فوراً، فهذه وأمثالها من معوقات النصر، وهي سبب في نزول غضب الله علينا جميعاً.
May be necessary to assist with. Their specific mission remains to be seen, but there are many uses for American soldiers right now in the Middle East.
And given your military experience, what strategies do you think should be employed to prevent the Israel-Hamas war from escalating?
Well, I think it's difficult right now to be able to say that it can be de-escalated in some respects with using American forces or even a threat of their use, but the deterrent effect is worth it. I think that's so far a working strategy. But the other thing I would be concerned about, frankly, is American forces in places like Iraq or Syria, where their strategy and their purpose there are largely undefined. And so we're leaving American soldiers out there basically in the desert in the Middle East that are exposed to attacks from multiple enemies who probably they shouldn't be there. That's one of the things I would consider doing, is just not having American forces there in the first place.
And air defense systems and elements are being deployed to deter further violence against Israel in the region. And what do you think is the significance of that in terms of the broader military strategy of the U.S. here?
Well, I think that's significant in the fact that it's a deterrent effect. It's defense, and it's not defined as offense. So we're doing our best to make sure that we're going in there to be a protector, and that's about it. Because right now we're not prepared to say that we need to be on the offense against, well, frankly, anybody. And Congress has not authorized anything like that in the first place, and that's Congress's job, not the president's. He can't make that decision. So that's critical to know as well. But those air defense systems are on the way, and they're actually spread in numerous countries.
And how do you think the U.S. military could better protect U.S. troops over there?
Well, first of all, and a lot of them are, people like the Navy, of course, in the Mediterranean and other locations in the seas around the area, and to keep them there is one good way to protect them. The other way to protect them is to make sure that they're not in the places where they don't need to be. And I would actually consider removing them from some of those countries, especially like Syria, where we're there as more like occupiers than anything else. They've never invited us to be there, so we really shouldn't be there. Their strategy is not defined. So why risk them in a mission that's not defined or understood or even really constitutionally authorized? So in some cases, let's just take them out of harm's way.
And how do you see the fluctuations in the number of troops who are ready to be deployed to the Middle East at this point affecting the overall military strategy and the situation on the ground?
Well, first of all, I think we're assuming that there is really a sound strategy in place in the first place at all. And I'm not sure that that's there. I'm not sure it's been shared to the American people who own the decision of whether or not this happens in the first place. So that's one of my concerns. And what they're doing with them specifically, I'm always concerned about the increasing numbers of American military forces in the region that actually makes it easier to target them or increases the chances of an accident that could cause us to get drawn into a larger war, or we could be the cause of a larger conflict. That's something we should be concerned about.
And given your expertise in military affairs, how do you think international coalitions and partnerships could play a role in stabilizing things in the Middle East?
Well, partnerships are always key to how we do business, and that's whether it be NATO or other areas around the world. Because if we have a common vision of democratic nations and how we operate, we can all come together and improve things. I think the Middle East is one of the greatest challenges towards that, because who do they hate almost as much as Israel is generally Western democracies, and specifically the U.S. So we have to weigh the fact that our presence there might actually make it worse than better. But it doesn't always have to be military either. I think there are definitely economic things that we can be doing. In fact, we should be doing first, just like we used to do with Iran before Biden took office.
All right, Colonel Darren Gaub, great to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Coming up, Texas police may soon be able to arrest illegal.
Some concerns now with the influx of people coming in, that the very freedoms that America stands for could be disappearing. Give us a sense of what the U.S. needs to do now so that we ensure the American way of life stays.
Well, I think one of the first things we need to do is acknowledge the problem on a wide scale. You'll still have people arguing that asylum seeking is not against the law. Absolutely not. That's correct. However, illegally entering the United States is against the law, even to claim asylum. So we have mechanisms for the border, and we have totally abandoned them. We have mechanisms to perform worksite enforcement in the United States, to remove dangerous offenders, to find out who all these people are and what they're doing. And that's ICE. They have been dismantled by policy. So what we need to do is get back to those policies that keep people from leaving their homes. The place to secure the border is not Eagle Pass, Texas. The place to secure the border is through policy that stretches all the way to these countries, where people realize you can spend all the money you want, you can leave your life savings behind, you can die in a jungle or die at the river, but you are not going to come in the United States unless you meet the parameters that are legally set in our immigration law. We allow in over 1 million people every year legally, but we're neglecting that, and we're focusing all of our resources on illegal entry. FEMA has spent over $363 million last year alone, according to their figures, to reimburse this mechanism of releasing people into the United States, cities and non-government shelters. We are spending millions a day to take care of unaccompanied migrant children. So this is costing us in a number of ways, and we cannot sustain it for much longer. Even New York is trying to offer plane tickets to fly migrants away from their city that they once said was a sanctuary city. So the border is a complete mess. It's a mess where Michael's at. It's a mess where Jason visits. And like they all say, it's multifaceted, and the dangers go beyond just the human beings crossing the border.
And Michael, you've said how
hostages from 35 different nationalities. We demand not only the U.S., but all of the international community put at its highest agenda, number one agenda, bring the hostages back home now.
Hamas's military unit says the Israeli bombardment so far has killed 50 of the hostages the militants abducted during their October 7th assault. As for Americans, at least 10 are still being held by Hamas in Gaza. Meanwhile, the U.S. military launched airstrikes on 2 locations in eastern Syria linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. The move comes in retaliation after at least 12 attacks on U.S. bases and personnel in Iraq and 4 in Syria since the 17th. 21 Americans were injured in 2 of those assaults. Information about the specific targets and other details have not been provided. President Joe Biden is said to have directed the narrowly tailored strikes to make clear that the U.S. will not tolerate such attacks and will defend itself, its personnel, and its interests. The Pentagon maintains the operation is separate from Israel's war against Hamas, adding the U.S. does not seek a broader conflict.
Test sites in recent years. This comes amid growing tension between these countries. What do these images reveal? Here's the take from Jeffrey Lewis, a professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. He told CNN that there are a lot of hints that suggest Russia, China, and the United States might resume nuclear testing. Here's a snapshot of a Russian nuclear test site located in the Arctic Ocean archipelago. Satellite images show different buildings under construction. Lewis said Russia had been digging new tunnels, which could be a sign that they're prepared to resume testing. This is a satellite image of the nuclear test site in Nevada. It shows an underground facility has been expanded from 2018 to 2023. Lewis added the U.S. has a policy of always being prepared to do a nuclear test on 6 months' notice. Now moving over to China, here's a nuclear test site in China's western Xinjiang. It shows new constructions built in recent years. Another satellite image shows new underground tunnels. In addition to nuclear test sites, China has been expanding its nuclear forces. Beijing has about 500 nuclear warheads as of May. Its nuclear stockpile has been growing faster than the Pentagon's projections.
China's top diplomat kicking off a 3-day visit to the U.S.
It's another milestone in that effort to keep their lines of communication open.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is the highest-ranking Chinese official to visit Washington in the last 5 years. He's reportedly set to meet with President Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan this week. It is the latest move by Washington and Beijing to keep high-level talks open amid growing tensions. Discussions will center on the Israel-Hamas war, the conflict in Ukraine, and the recent boat clash between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea. China has criticized Israel for its response and called for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. Wang's visit is seen as paving the way for a meeting between Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping next month in San Francisco.
China's former premier Li Keqiang has died. Li was China's premier from 2013 to 2023. He was shuffled out recently by Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping. Chinese media report that Keqiang died of a heart attack.
What would happen if a ceasefire began in Gaza? Russia and China vetoed a U.S. effort on Wednesday for the UN to act on the Israel-Hamas war. The U.S. draft would have reaffirmed Israel's right to defend itself and approved humanitarian pauses to deliver aid to Gaza. Here's more.
China defended its veto Thursday of a drafted resolution at the UN Security Council. The U.S. proposed the draft. It defends Israel's right to self-defense, calls for a humanitarian pause to the war in Gaza, and demands that Iran stop exporting arms to militant groups. 10 countries said yes, 3 said no, and 2 chose not vote in the 15-member council on Wednesday. The resolution was not adopted because both Russia and China cast vetoes. The United Arab Emirates also voted against it. An additional vote was cast on a Russian-drafted resolution calling for a ceasefire. China and the United Arab Emirates were the only country to vote in favor of the draft. The U.S. and Britain opposed the measure. The White House warned against a ceasefire earlier this week.
We're going to continue to make sure Israel has the tools and the capabilities that they need to defend themselves. And as I think you've heard us say, a ceasefire right now really only benefits Hamas.
Kirby also expressed U.S. concerns about future attacks on American troops. At least 9 vetoes are needed for a resolution. Adopting it would also require no vetoes from the U.S., France, Britain, Russia, or China. Israel's ambassador to the UN called those rejected the U.S. draft oblivious to Israel's suffering, saying, quote, "How would Beijing respond if genocidal jihadists beheaded and murdered your babies?" China has never condemned Hamas's terrorist attack. The country also put pressure on Israel to stop bombing Gaza after Tel Aviv vowed to eradicate the terrorist group.
President Joe Biden serving around the world. In terms of what needs to be done, is anyone listening? How can that message come across so that change actually takes place?
Yeah, I don't mean it's an all-out war in a way. I mean this is straight up all-out war, genocidal war. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And it's not about, Guatemala's policy or anybody else. It's World Economic Forum and Chinese Communist Party are the main engines of this. They're not the only engines, but they're the main engines. Interestingly, by the way, on cult activity or that sort of thing in chicken blood, down the Darien Gap earlier this year, some Chinese came through, a group of 6 or 7, and they came and stayed at this one-star hotel that I often stay at. I've stayed for months in this hotel down in the Darien. And they negotiated a price for a chicken. They chopped its head off, and they drank its blood out of small glasses. And they just took shot drinks out of its blood. I published this at the time. Very interesting. Yeah. That was actually Chinese coming through. But the bottom line is, this is not Panamanian policy. This is, if you go to Panama, right next to the Panama Canal, an old former U.S. military headquarters area, right next to the canal, is now United Nations. World Economic Forum has their signs and whatnot there. They've got the IOM is there. These gentlemen know all about IOM or OIM, depending on what language you're speaking. IOM is the sort of pump for immigration for the United Nations. Their headquarters is there. These are the ones. If you go to the Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, it's IOM that has a ticket desk at Terminal 3. If you go in there and go through the doors, go to the left, and you'll see there's a ticket terminal. And I've sat there numerous times watching them help people get through. You go to Istanbul Airport, it's the same thing. It's the same ecosystems everywhere I go. It's the Red Cross, it's Catholic Charities, it's the same ecosystems everywhere. These are also just fronts for these major globalist players. And this is all about trade routes. This is all about repopulating places. This is straight up war, and there's going to be a huge amount of death, and it's coming right now, and it's already started.
And on that note, Jason, we have about 1 minute left. You've touched on the issues that you're seeing in this administration, various departments. What is the solution here?
Designate the Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, reinforce the rule of law, as Randy has talked about, because Americans need to know USC 1325 is not being enforced at all. On top of that, smugglers being apprehended by Border Patrol agents 7 and 15 times before U.S. attorneys will even take on cases. Look, I'm a big believer here. If as a nation you can't get the little things right, you will never get the big things right. And we have got to start reinforcing the law. And I want to go back to one thing, too, that was said earlier by Randy, and he's right. Border security doesn't start at our border. It ends at our border. We've not only got to enforce the rule of law, but we got to start working this downrange before they ever get here. It's a policy failure. It's a policy issue. They've done it by design, as Michael has said. And if we make these changes, and I mean this as somebody that knows these cartels and has a synergy with these dark networks around the world, we have got to go after them and absolutely crush them for what they have done to so many innocent families in Mexico, in the United States, and around the world. And if we start doing that, you're going to see massive changes very quickly, very fast.
Well, there ain't no rock and roll ever since they sold out.